Elite Facts presents
17 historical predictions that became true.
17.
French political thinker Alexis de Tocqueville predicts the Cold War 100 years before it began, 1840. A French historian and political thinker, Alexis toured the USA before releasing his book Democracy in America in 1840. In this book, he seemingly predicted the Cold War, stating, quote, "There are now two great nations in the world which, starting from different points, seem to be advancing toward the same goal, the Russians and the Anglo-Americans. Their point of departure is different and their paths diverse. Nevertheless, each seems called by some secret desire of providence one day to hold in its hands the destinies of half the world." Sound familiar?
16.
A French marshal knew that the Versailles Treaty was not peace and predicted war would return in 20 years, 1919. Marshal Ferdinand Foch, who served as a French soldier and as the Allied Generalissima during the First World War, believed Germany needed to be greatly weakened and devoid of any military strength at the Paris Peace Conference. He argued that the Great War had proven that Germany needed to be prevented from rising as a force once again, and stated that once the Treaty of Versailles was signed in June of 1919, quote, "This is not peace, it is an armistice for 20 years. When Germany invaded Poland on September 1st, 1939, World War II began, 20 years after Foch said those infamous words.
15.
Jules Vernes' forecast of the first moon landing was eerily specific, 104 years before it happened, 1865. Jules Verne, best known for his adventure novels Journey to the Center of the Earth, Around the World in 80 Days, and 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, predicted the Apollo moon landing 104 years before it actually happened. In 1865, he wrote a short story named From the Earth to the Moon, and in it, he predicted that the ship would be named Apollo. The launch would take place from Florida, and that 3 astronauts would fly into space. Perhaps most amazing, however, is that he knew the astronauts would feel a sense of weightlessness in space and on the moon, even though the differing properties of gravity in space had yet to be determined at that time.
14.
H.G. Wells forecast the invention of atomic bombs, 1913. It seems H.G. Wells liked to predict the destruction of humanity because, as well as penning his most famous work, The War of the Worlds, in which Earth is attacked by extraterrestrial life forms, he also forecast the use of the atomic bomb in his 1914 novel, The World Set Free. In it, the Englishman wrote, quote, "The atomic bombs were thrown. They made a mighty thunder in the air, leaving a flaring trail in the sky, a black background to these tremendous pillars of fire, and radioactive vapor drifting somewhere scores of miles from the bomb center and killing all they overtook." The USA started the Manhattan Project in 1940 and then dropped bombs on Hiroshima on August 6, 1945, and Nagasaki on August 9, 1945, where up to 246,000 Japanese people perished in a cloud of ash.
13.
The Onion predicts George W. Bush's War on Terror, 2001. The Onion, clearly thrilled by George W. Bush's inauguration as the 43rd President of the United States, published an article on January 17, 2001, welcoming the Republican to office. Within the article, they stated that, quote, "The U.S. will engage in at least one Gulf War-level armed conflict in the next 4 years." Within 10 months, the U.S. had invaded Afghanistan in response to the 9/11 attacks, and within 3 years, the U.S. military had also infiltrated the sovereign borders of Iraq. Bush's war on terror was seemingly inevitable.
12.
Gullivers Travels describes Mars' 2 moons 151 years before they were discovered, 1726. Irish literary legend Jonathan Swift penned Gulliver's Travels, a satirical book about human nature, in 1726, detailing the many adventures of a journeyman. In one particular extract, he wrote, quote, "2 lesser stars or satellites which revolve about Mars." Asaph Hall in 1877 discovered for the first time that Mars did, in fact, have 2 moons, Phobos and Deimos. Well, he wasn't called Swift for nothing.
11.
Tom Clancy's Ghost Recon depicts the Russo-Georgian War 7 years before it happened, 2001. The original Tom Clancy's Ghost Recon was released in 2001, and the military tactical shooter game is based in Russia, where there has been civil unrest and heightened tension with neighboring Georgia. Although the U.S. has deployed ghosts in this fictional conflict, it is set in April of 2008, just 4 months before the Russo-Georgian War began, when the Russians deployed troops into South Ossetia.
10,
Nostradamus predicts that London would be burnt by fire in the year 66, 111 years before it did, 1555. Michel de Nostradami, better known by his Latinized name Nostradamus, was a French author and astrological consultant who made a number of predictions in Les Prophéties, his book released in 1555. As well as seeming to predict the French Revolution and the rise of Hitler in Germany, Nostradamus wrote, quote, "The blood of the just will be demanded of London, burnt by the fire of 66. Eerily, the Great Fire of London started at a bakery on Pudding Lane and destroyed 80,000 homes in the city in September of 1666.
9,
2001, A Space Odyssey predicts the use of iPads to read the news, 1968. Arthur C. Clarke wrote his novel 2001, A Space Odyssey in 1968, the same year in which Stanley Kubrick directed a film of the same name, both of which depict humans encountering mysterious black monoliths and flying to Jupiter. The futuristic sci-fi story, set at the turn of the millennium, features a scene where 2 astronauts are reading their newspapers while eating their food. Intriguingly, though, their newspapers are actually news pads, which look remarkably like iPads. In his book, Clarke describes the device as follows, quote, "When he had tired of official report, memoranda, and minutes, he would plug his newspad into the ship's information circuit and scan the latest reports from Earth. One by one, he would conjure up the world's major electronic papers. Each had its own 2-digit reference. When he had punched that, a postage-sized rectangle would expand till it nearly filled the screen, and he would read it with comfort. When he finished, he could flash back to the completely page and select a new subject for detailed examination. One could spend an entire lifetime doing nothing but absorbing the ever-changing flow of information from the news satellites." Sounds very much like the 21st century.
8,
Robert Boyle predicts more than 15 future scientific inventions in the 1600s, 1662. Irish chemist and physicist Robert Boyle discovered Boyle's Law, which relates pressure and volume in gas, but he also published a wish list of 24 possible future inventions in 1662. Of the 24 he listed, at least 15 have come true. They include the art of flying. The first aircraft took flight in 1903. The art of continuing long underwater and the exercise of functioning freely there. The first mechanical submarine was launched in 1863. The cure of diseases at a distance, or at least by transplantation. Transplants became regular medical procedures by the end of the 19th century. Mr. Boyle had quite a wish list, and if he gets his way, then the prolongation of life will soon follow.
7,
Morgan Robertson's short story comes true when the Titanic sinks 14 years later, 1898. American author Morgan Robertson penned Futility or the Wreck of the Titan in 1898, a book in which he predicted the world's largest ship, described as unsinkable and one of the greatest accomplishments of mankind, carrying as few lifeboats as the law allowed, collided with an iceberg 400 miles off the coast of Newfoundland. Fast forward 16 years later, and the Titanic, meeting all of that criteria, infamously sinks in the exact same manner.
6,
John Brunner nearly predicted Barack Obama's rise to the presidency, 1968. British author John Brunner's characters in his 1968 sci-fi novel Stand on Zanzibar were frighteningly accurate. He almost exactly predicted that Barack Obama would be president of the United States in 2010. In actual fact, the leader is named President Obomi, but his family did originate from Africa, and Obama's father was born in Kenya. Bizarre, and almost an exact prediction, but not quite.
5,
Frank Zappa forecasts digitally accessible music, 1989. American musician and songwriter Frank Zappa was always an unusual character during his lifetime, but it seems that he was also extremely forward-thinking. In The Real Frank Zappa book in 1989, he wrote, quote, "We propose to acquire the rights to digitally duplicate and store the best of every record company's quality catalog items, store them in a central processing location, and have them accessible by phone or cable TV, directly patchable into the user's home taping appliances. All accounting for royalty payments, billing to the customer, etc. would be automatic, built into the software." Okay, so illegal streaming aside, Zappa knew exactly the way the music industry was heading.
4.
Russian Prince Vladimir Odst envisioned the Internet, 1835. Imperial Russian Prince Vladimir Odst was also an author during his spare time, and he had started writing a utopian novel named Year 4338, but was unable to complete it before his death. In one of the passages that he wrote, he is credited with predicting blogging and the Internet. He wrote, quote, "Finally, today we received a household journal from the Prime Minister, where we, among others, were invited to a soiree. You need to know that in many houses, especially those well-connected, such journals were published, having replaced regular correspondence. The journals usually provide information about the host's good or bad health, family news, various thoughts and comments, small inventions, as well as invitations. In case of a dinner invitation, also the menu. Besides, for communicating in emergency, friends' houses are connected by means of magnetic telegraphs that allow people who live far from each other to talk to each other."
3.
News of the Future accurately predicts Ronald Reagan's rise to presidency and the year the Berlin Wall would be destroyed, 1969. The U.S. comedy show Rowan and Martin's Laugh-In featured a sketch titled News of the Future, in which bizarre future stories were broadcast as fact. Indeed, two of them did actually accurately predict events in separate episodes in 1969. First of all, it was predicted that then Hollywood actor Ronald Reagan would be in the White House in 1989. He became the 40th President of the United States, holding office between 1981 and 1989. And second, that the Berlin Wall would fall in 1989, which it did in November of that year.
2.
U.S. Army Service General forewarns his government of an attack on Pearl Harbor 16 years in advance, 1925. General Billy Mitchell of the U.S. Army Air Service produced an intelligence report in 1925 which accurately predicted how a future war with Japan would unfold, almost to the exact detail. Mitchell believed the Japanese would attack Pearl Harbor before they invaded the Philippines on a Sunday morning. He wrote, quote, "Attack will be launched as follows. Bombardment, attack to be made on Ford Island in Pearl Harbor at 7:30 a.m. Attack to be made on Clark Field, Philippines at 10:40 a.m. Pearl Harbor was attacked by Japan at 7:55 a.m. on Sunday, December 5, 1941. And later that same day, they then bombed Clark Field at 12:35 p.m. Spooky.
1.
Abraham Lincoln foresees his own assassination, 1865. Certainly not something you want to see before it happens, but it is claimed by Ward Hill Lamon, a friend of Abraham Lincoln, that the 16th President of the United States had an eerily prophetic nightmare just 3 days before he was shot and killed by John Wilkes Booth in April of 1865. Lamon, in his biography of Lincoln, claimed the president told him of his dream, quote, "There seemed to be a death-like stillness about me. Then I heard subdued sobs as if a number of people were weeping. I thought I left my bed and wandered downstairs. There the silence was broken by the same pitiful sobbing, but the mourners were invisible. Determined to find the cause of a state of things so mysterious and so shocking, I kept on until I arrived at the East Room, which I entered. There I met with a sickening surprise. There before me was a catafalque on which rested a corpse wrapped in funeral vestments. Around it were stationed soldiers who were acting as guards, and there was a throng of people gazing mournfully upon the corpse, whose face was covered, others weeping pitifully. 'Who is dead in the White House?' I demanded of one of the soldiers. 'The president,' was his answer. 'He was killed by an assassin.' Then came a loud burst of grief from the crowd, which woke me from my dream."
Don't forget to like us and subscribe for more elite facts.